One. All right, Sophia. So I always like to ask people about their childhood to start things off. I know you grew up. Your dad was a big football coach. Your mom from Costa Rica. So definitely some interesting parts just on the surface about your childhood. When you think back to your days growing up, what are the things that really stand out to you? Interests, hobbies, influences, whatever jumps out.
Yeah, I mean, I would say both of those things really created kind of the foundation of how I grew up. With my dad being a high school football coach, he started at my high school when I was in kindergarten, and he was coaching even before that. So for me, it was like I really grew up at that high school, Edgewood High School in Madison, and I always tell people that if they've seen the movie Remember the Titans, that I basically had the life of Cheryl, the coach's daughter, Coach Yost's daughter. And that was one of my favorite movies kind of growing up when that movie came out. And so many people who knew my family, said something along the lines of, you could have been that girl in that movie. It was very similar, my brothers and I, we were always running around the high school and the gym and the weight room, and my dad would, give us projects to help him out, whether it was, going to pick up equipment and sort stuff into piles, and the workouts, timing players, making Gatorade, film, everything. It was like he really included us in all of that. He made us feel a part of it. It was fun for us. We had a blast making, forts out of tackling dummies, and just, we would just entertain ourselves at practice. And then I think because we were around that so much, obviously we all, we grew up in a sports environment. So we kind of played everything growing up. My brothers were 3-sport athletes. They played football, basketball, baseball. And for me, they played soccer as well. For me, I got into volleyball and basketball. Played a little bit of t-ball, softball, but that just didn't really stick as much for me. So we had fun with it. And he was competitive with us. He put together weightlifting programs for us when we were pretty young. So that was definitely a big part of it. Just being around sports all the time was very normal for us. And then, on the side of my mom, Sylvia, she is from Costa Rica. And she was the first in her family to get married. And she married my dad, who's originally from Illinois. And so they moved to the U.S. After getting married in Costa Rica. And they did that primarily so my dad could keep teaching and coaching. She made that sacrifice to leave her home country and kind of never looked back. But it was something that was very much a part of our life. I was the first grandchild on that side of the family, and my grandparents didn't speak any English. So it was very much a rule and a part of our life at home that, when we were at home, we spoke all Spanish all the time with my mom. And she was very disciplined with us about that, about speaking Spanish to us, taking us down to Costa Rica every year. She would keep us down there for longer periods of time before we were in school because she really understood that was the best way for us to learn the language. So we still go back, every year at Christmas time. That was traditionally when my parents took us, or we'd go for spring break or over the summer. They always found a time to take us and made sure that we were very aware of that part of our background, that it was part of our life, and also just to stay connected with all of our family there.
So I think that Costa Rican element's really interesting. I'm the only one in my family born in America. Even my brothers and parents were born in South Africa. So I grew up with, I guess, a somewhat similar experience of not having American parents, or in your case, you had one, but one who was not. And there are a lot of things that I take away from my upbringing, whether it's cultural stuff from South Africa that my family brought to America, or just the ways they went about things. I'm curious, beyond the learning Spanish and really immersing yourself in that way, what are some of the cultural elements that maybe is important to folks like your mother who grew up in Costa Rica that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten exposed to that you did growing up with a Costa Rican mother in America?
Yeah, I think, the language is the obvious one, of just speaking Spanish all the time and having that foundation. And my parents always told us, like, we're doing this because this is your background and this is your family and this is important. But I think they also understood that there was significant value for us personally and professionally, right? Like, just no matter what you do, there's value in having a second language. So that was the obvious one. And then I think just, the connection to family. I think the Latin culture is so family oriented. It was a big deal for my mom to marry an American and leave and move to the U.S. And again, all of her family is still there. They all live fairly close to each other, typical, like, go over to my grandparents' house on a Sunday, right, for family lunch or dinner. It's a very connected family culture. And that was something that my parents really instilled in us too. Just the importance of that and the value of that. And then I think even just culturally, like the time that we spent down there, my grandfather has a beef cattle farm. So we would, we'd ride horses and we'd, mess around with the baby calves and we'd learn about branding cattle. And, we got to see so much as kids that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, growing up in Madison, Wisconsin. So, despite the stereotype that everybody in Wisconsin lives on a farm, that was not my reality. So, we were exposed to a lot, obviously getting to travel as much as we did, just seeing different parts of the world, different lifestyles, different cultures. I think there was a lot of value in that, of recognizing, that even our life in the U.S. was different than what my cousins were living in Costa Rica. There were still very much similarities there, but also differences, and that was okay. And it was just good to, like, be aware of all of those things.
Just curious, what is your favorite Costa Rican meal?
Oh gosh, well, my grandfather's farm is on the Pacific coast, in the Guanacaste, Nicoya Peninsula. So, I mean, you're 10 minutes from the beach. So I love, like, the ceviche, all the fresh seafood, of course, like the rice and beans, which you can make. I don't know, it just doesn't taste the same when you come here and you try to make it. Like, I tell my aunts that all the time. I'm like, they're frijoles, like they taste better there than even if I try to recreate it at home. So I would say definitely the ceviche. Growing up and being at my grandpa's farm, we would do kind of big cookouts and stuff, and they would make chicharrones, which are like pork rinds. So, I mean, just things like that, again, it's just so tied to our time there that even when you try to make it here at home, it's just not the same.
All right, I was told I have to ask you how your parents met. I imagine there's a story behind there, and based on your laugh, I guess there is. If you wouldn't mind sharing, how did your parents meet?
Sure. Yeah, it is a great story, and I tell them all the time. It was kind of like, okay, no pressure on my brothers and I to try to top this story, because it's really a crazy story. So my mom, who grew up in Costa Rica, she was the third of 8 kids, and my grandfather wanted them to have experiences abroad, kind of whatever that looked like. So the oldest one, Tony, her brother, he did a program to study abroad, and he was placed in Illinois for his senior year of high school. And he was placed with the Minnaert family, which is my dad's family. And my dad is from a really small rural town in the Quad Cities area of Illinois. I think the population is like 800 or 900 people. So Tony and my dad, Alan, were seniors in high school together. And my dad had 2 brothers as well. And they also lived on a farm. So it was a really cool connection of, Tony had all this interest in farming from my grandpa and agriculture and the business of it. And that's very much what my dad and his brothers were into as well, being on a farm. So Tony spent all of his senior year there with my dad and his family in Illinois, graduated, went back to Costa Rica to go to college. My dad also went to college and then went down to Costa Rica to go visit Tony, and he met my mom, Sylvia, who I think was 16 at the time. And that was how they initially met. He spoke a little bit of Spanish, not much. Kind of same story for her. She spoke a little bit of English, not really much of anything. So that's how they met. And then my mom did the same program. She was placed as a senior in high school in Pennsylvania. Had a great experience there with her host family. My dad was in college at the time. And so they just kind of started writing letters, very old school, as long-distance calling was so expensive in the 70s. And so they started writing letters. And so from the time that they met in 1977, this whole process took about 7 years. And they were married in Costa Rica in December of 1984.
That's amazing.
It's crazy, right? Crazy.
I just want
to... what's cool is, some of my mom's siblings kind of in their time abroad, like her sister went and spent some time with the Minnaert family in Illinois. There was another brother who came over and spent some time there. So it kind of created this connection between the two families. And then my dad's parents went down to Costa Rica to visit Tony and kind of meet the rest of the family. So it created this family connection that still exists to this day. With my mom and her siblings, they visit my dad's parents in Illinois. So it's a crazy story, one that you kind of can't really make up.
That's really special too. And just to think back then, you mentioned writing letters and the cost of calling, now it's, I guess, like you take for granted how easy it is. You just shoot someone a text or, email. That stuff didn't exist back then. Now I feel bad. I met my wife on a blind date. That's not nearly as fun or creative as that. I got to come up with a better story.
I know. That's why I say it's like my parents, we always knew the story, but I think my parents were always kind of cautious about talking about it a lot, kind of for that reason. Like they didn't want to create this sort of unrealistic expectation, right? I don't know how you top that story.
I don't think you can.
Know how you top it. So it's very cool though, and I think what's cool now is just how connected the two families still are.
Yeah, that really is neat. All right, so let's talk a little bit about broadcasting. I read that you got your start at 15. That was your first, I guess, exposure to broadcasting. What drew you to that? Why were you interested at that age and just even giving it a shot?
Yeah, I think, again, this goes back to my dad of, we would go to every game, and then my brothers and I would be running around on the field after the game, and, my dad would talk to the local sports writer or local TV station, whoever was there covering the game. And I'd, tag along and listen, or I'd watch it back at home, or then I'd read the newspaper story the next day, and I'd kind of offer my feedback at such a young age. I kind of laugh at that of like, well, that's not really what you said, or that's not really how that went, or why did they write this, or why didn't they include this part? And so I was always just kind of interested in the media part of it. And then finally it kind of came to this point of like, well, why don't you do that? You could be the one asking the questions. You could be the one doing the work. And so again, I was around it. I saw it from an early age. I liked it. And, because of being around my dad's football teams and around that environment, I kind of got to know some of these local sports writers. There was a high school sports website that was starting at the time. There was, I was connected to a high school sports production company, which is where I started working when I was 15. And so they were creating kind of these documentary-style highlight films covering an entire season for a football team or basketball, whatever. They covered a lot of sports. So I started working there and, learned just the basics of shooting and editing and covering a game and all of that. Started writing for this high school sports website because I was like, well, I'm at all these games anyway. I might as well do something productive. So yeah, that's kind of how it started, which was in high school sports. And then fast forward a little bit, when I graduated from Marquette in 2009, my plan was to send out demo reels to kind of all the local TV stations and try to latch on that way because that's the traditional path. And that production company that I had worked for in high school had pivoted their business model, and they had now acquired the broadcast rights to all of the high school state sports and state tournaments, and they were starting to do live web streams of all these games and all these state tournaments. So when I graduated, they said, well, while you're looking for a job, why don't you come back, help us out through the summer? We're in the middle of our spring tournament season. It's crazy. We need help. And then we'll go from there. And I ended up staying almost 3 years. So I took a little bit of an untraditional path, but that start in high school sports was probably the best place for me to learn and get reps and be in kind of that live sports environment.
So was broadcasting a love at first sight type thing? Was it like immediately, hey, this is maybe something I'd want to do? Or was it at first more, hey, this is a fun thing to do while, I don't know, I'm just trying to try things out and have fun before I got to make some serious adult decisions?
Yeah, it's funny because I watched, women on TV, like women like Hannah Storm and Susie Colbert and Pam Oliver. And so I certainly saw that at a young age, and I wasn't necessarily sold on television. I just knew I wanted to be in media, and I was kind of open to what that looked like, whether it was writing, journalism. I was aware of like the web presence, radio, TV, obviously. So I was kind of all over the place, to be honest. I just knew I wanted to be in it. And so at Marquette, I decided to do a journalism and Spanish double major because I thought, well, no matter what, journalism will give me the good writing, reporting skills that will have value kind of whichever direction I decide to go. And I knew I wanted to study abroad, which is why I did the Spanish major. And then it was really the broadcasting thing really clicked for me when the summer between my junior and my senior year in 2008, I had the opportunity to do an internship at ESPN in Bristol, Connecticut. And it was really working in studio production at ESPN that summer that really cemented the broadcasting for me. Like just being in that environment, seeing the live shows, helping kind of put on these shows on a nightly basis, watching the talent work, just all the behind the scenes of how these shows come together, of producers and directors and production assistants that are editing and writing and the talent then going on and seeing what you see on TV. That's really what cemented the broadcasting thing for me. And so then I came back for my senior year at Marquette, and I did basically a year-long internship with the sports department and the ABC affiliate here in Milwaukee. And that's really where I kind of made the pivot to broadcasting and thought, okay, this is the path for me. Like I really want to be in this live sports production environment.
Was there anyone, and I'd read about your experience there at ESPN, was there anyone in particular that stands out to you to this day who really influenced you, whether it was someone in front of the camera, behind the camera, that just kind of took you under their wing, or was it just kind of the whole body of folks you interacted with during that time?
It was definitely the whole experience, and I say that because they were wonderful to us in terms of they kind of told us, listen, this internship is going to be what you make of it. So if you want to spend time on another show, if you want to shadow somebody, if you want to set up a meeting, we're all open to that. They made us feel included, and that was permissible, and the staff there was open to it, and they were also flexible in terms of like accommodating our interests. So that we could really be exposed to the things that we wanted to be. And I would say, Rob King was the person that I met. He came and gave a lecture at Marquette, and at the time he was like the editor-in-chief of ESPN.com. He's now one of the senior VPs of production. He's really impactful and wonderful person. And he was really the first connection. So Rob King, and then Wendy Nix was incredible to me. She really became a go-to person for me in terms of someone, again, who was willing to let me shadow them for a couple days at a time, let me talk to them about different things that they had experienced in their career, how she was navigating, life as a working mom and all that stuff. So she was one, and then just a number of like the producers and supervisors that I got to work with, like Greg Colley, Adam Stanko, a lot of the fellow interns I'm still friends with today and kind of follow what they're doing. So yeah, there were definitely, I think just the whole experience, again, they were so open to our questions, our interests, and allowing us to pursue different things, which was really cool.
Sophia, was baseball? I know you obviously grew up around football and around sports, but did you have a love for baseball that I imagine maybe you have now, or was that something that kind of evolved over time?
It's funny because I get that question, and when I was growing up, and even when I started this job with Fox Sports Wisconsin in 2013, a lot of people were like, why aren't you covering football? Like that seemed like the obvious one. But yeah, I mean, I definitely grew up liking baseball. Like we would go to games at County Stadium, Bob Uecker on the radio, just like every other Wisconsin household, right? And, my dad actually, because he grew up in the Quad Cities area, he grew up a Cardinals fan. So we would even go to Cardinals games or go to St. Louis, go to Busch Stadium. So I definitely grew up with baseball around, went to games, liked it. Quite frankly, the Brewers weren't very good when I was a kid. So it was more just it was fun to go to a baseball game, And I would say it probably wasn't until I was in college, the 2008 season when they finally broke through the playoff drought, 26 years. I kind of latched onto it later in life, I would say. And then I think it just sort of evolved where that's where I had an opportunity. I think obviously the bilingual thing, that has more value in Major League Baseball than in any other professional sport. And I think once I was in it, I really grew to love it even more. Just being in it every day, getting to know the people, learning more about the game, learning more about the strategy and the decisions and kind of how a season unfolds. It's infinitely different now than even when I started. Even just going back to being a fan in high school and college, I think it's obviously, you just learn so much more. You love it so much more. But yeah, it's funny because I think as a kid, if you would have told me I was doing what I'm doing now, I think that would have been surprising.
One of the things you do that I absolutely love, and for people listening, it probably isn't a surprise that you have this in your skill set, but the ability to communicate not just with the English-speaking players, but the Spanish-speaking players, and you do these bilingual interviews where you're able to convey what these players who otherwise maybe wouldn't have a platform to accurately or adequately express themselves to the English-speaking fans, but you kind of allow them to do that. And I remember my first, not that I ever didn't think it was a challenge, but when my first year broadcasting the minors, you're around these young kids, 16, 17, 18 years old, who are in a country that, they know very little about. They don't speak the language. And that was like a wake-up call for me as to how difficult that must be. Without being in their shoes, the fact that they are fighting for their professional lives, but doing so in an incredibly unfamiliar environment. And I imagine the players, even though to do it at the major league level, they have achieved success, I imagine they appreciate that there is someone who is able to communicate with them and kind of be an intermediary between the English-speaking fans and the Spanish-speaking fans. What is it about that is so important for you? Why is doing that, other than just showing off an ability to speak Spanish? Because I don't think it's just that. Why is connecting with the Spanish-speaking players and connecting the fans with them so important to you?
Yeah, I think you said it, and it's the word connection, right? I think for me, it's about that connection, and it's also about comfort. First of all, I think it's important for any player to have the ability to express themselves, to be able to speak on their own, to be able to share their story, to be able to talk about whatever's going on the field, if that's what we're talking about. I think it's important for all of them to have the same opportunity to do that. I think as a fan and a viewer, you want to feel connected to these people. I mean, they are, the top 1% of athletes, and they do amazing physical things on the field, but they're people too. A lot of them have really interesting stories. And I think you, as a fan and as a viewer, you connect with them more when you feel like you get to know them, and you invest a little bit more in them. And so I think, our job is to be the liaison between the two and to tell the stories when it's appropriate and to help our fans and our viewers feel connected to the players on the field that they're watching every night. So I think it's ultimately about connection. And then I think for me, it's about comfort. I don't take for granted the fact that a player might trust me to do the interview the way that we do it, where I'm translating for them. And I always tell them, like, I will try to do this as accurately as possible. I'm not going to get it verbatim, but I always try to be as accurate as I possibly can be. And so I don't take for granted the fact that they trust me to do that, because it really is a two-way street. They do have to trust me to do that. And in turn, I don't take for granted, having the permission to tell that story or to speak on their behalf and help the fans and the viewers feel connected to them in that way. And, I recognize too, like, we had the opportunity with Fox in 2013 to spend just over 2 weeks in the Dominican Republic. And we did a series of shows for the Brewers and the Twins on baseball in the Dominican Republic. And it was so eye-opening for me. And I think that's where I really had more of an appreciation and understanding of what these players go through. And it's multiple steps, right? I mean, they have a lot of pressure on them from even being 12, 13, 14 years old to when you can be, signed internationally at the age of 16, what these baseball academies are like in the Dominican Republic when you sign a professional contract at 16 years old. And also just the societal pressure of, for a lot of these kids, when they sign a contract, it's not just about them. They're often supporting a family, extended family. It becomes their job. It's no longer a hobby. It's a professional contract. And I mean, the odds are so stacked against them to even make it off the island, to leave the Dominican Republic and start working your way up the minor league system. So, one of my favorite stories that we did was with Carlos Gomez. And he was so emotional talking about what that time was like for him, of being a 16-year-old kid, leaving the Dominican Republic, leaving your family, crying on the airplane, getting to the U.S., not really speaking the language, sharing a story about going to Wendy's and ordering a sandwich, number 7, because that was his favorite number. And that's what he could afford. And then finally he learned how to say no pickles, because he didn't know the word for pickles, but he didn't like the pickles, so he would just take them off the sandwich. Like, things like that, you're like, wow. It's just something that, quite frankly, a player coming up here in the States can't really identify with. Most of them can't. To be a teenager and be on your own in a country where you don't speak the language, and by the way, you're also trying to perform to work your way up the minor league system. I mean, it's daunting. It is really, really daunting when you think about it. And so I just, seeing that firsthand, hearing their stories, I think was really what changed my perspective on it. And these players, and you know this, Jared, these players are critiqued and analyzed for every single thing that they do physically on the field. And the last thing I want is for them to feel that same sort of pressure and criticism for wanting to speak their mind or wanting to share their story or wanting to talk about the game that day or their career. So I try to at least create an opportunity where they feel comfortable doing that.
Well, and, you mentioned Carlos Gomez, and, we had the pleasure in Texas to have him for, a little more than a year. And, he came with, a reputation that was far different than the reality. I mean, this was, and obviously you got to know him. I mean, this is one of the kindest, happiest, most enjoyable people in baseball. And maybe because, he didn't speak the language or didn't speak it as well, I should say, he got this bad reputation when if you just have a conversation with the guy for 2 minutes, you realize that it's impossible to not love this guy and to not appreciate the way he plays. And I imagine there are so many players out there who don't have the ability to, whether it's defend themselves or express themselves in a way that allows them to connect, that, there are these reputations that are just so unfair. And I'm glad you brought up Carlos Gomez, because for me, he might be at the top of the list of guys who they're not, English is not their first language. And people say X, Y, and Z about them, but the reality isn't X, Y, and Z. It's A, B, and C.
Yeah, and I think that's on us, honestly, to be aware of that. Of like, when they're coming up, they're so consumed by this pressure to perform, right? And again, it comes from all those pressures that are on them as kids when they're coming up, and families that they're supporting, and they're on their own. And, everybody knows, like, time is on the clock. Your window is small. You have to maximize your opportunity. But the reality is, like, there's a lot going on for them off the field. The language is one of them. And I think, they're all at varying levels of confidence and comfort. It's one thing for, you to have a 2-minute conversation with Carlos Gomez in the dugout. It may be another thing to put a microphone in front of his face, to put a camera in front of his face. I mean, that's pressure, right? I think not everybody is comfortable with that, no matter what language you speak. And so I think that's on us to be aware of that and being sensitive to it. Is like, I use Freddie Peralta as an example now. He was 21 years old when he came up and made his major league debut. That's astonishing in itself. But, from where Freddie was at 21 when he made his debut to where he is now, I mean, he works hard at it. He wants feedback. He asks you for feedback. And he's also not afraid to say, you know what, I'd rather do this in Spanish because I want to get this out properly and I want to get this out the way I want to say it. And I respect him so much for saying that and owning that and for being willing to try and put yourself out there and know that you're going to make mistakes. That was something that Carlos Gomez said to me when we would talk about this kind of stuff, is he's like, I know my English is not perfect. I'm not going to pretend it's perfect. I know I'm going to make mistakes. I hope that you're okay with those mistakes. I'm like, absolutely. Like, I give you credit just for trying and putting yourself out there. So, I think that's on us as like media people, as fans, as viewers, as people that are like consuming this content, to have that awareness and that sensitivity and empathy, quite frankly, because they are trying, they're putting themselves out there, and a lot of them are working on it on their own, trying to improve.
Sophia mentioned her time in the Dominican Republic, and you go online. She wrote a piece back, I guess, shortly after your return in 2013 that kind of highlights some of the experiences, and I encourage people to look for it. It's pretty easy to find on Google, and there's some, I guess, anecdotes that are really neat, whether it's Gene Segura making baseball out of a sock and introducing people to Ozzie Virgil, who is kind of, in a way, I guess, the Jackie Robinson of the Dominican as far as it pertains to playing baseball at the major league level. It was really neat. I really enjoyed reading that, and I'm glad, and I appreciate you sharing some of those stories and those experiences, because I know that's powerful beyond just, hey, let's go and do a story here and produce some content. I know it probably meant much more to you than just that. I want to ask you, Sophia, you made the transition a few years ago from working for a TV network in Fox Sports to now working for the Brewers. And I know we have a very close mutual friend in Emily Jones, who I can only imagine has impacted you the way that she's influenced and impacted me. And she did something similar, where now, instead of working for Fox Sports Southwest, she works for the Rangers. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what led you to do that, and what are some of the differences and pleasures you've experienced getting to work for the Brewers as opposed to a network?
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate that the Brewers approached me with this idea and this opportunity for me to work directly for the team. And I think sometimes for the fan or the viewer, there's some confusion, right? Of like, well, do you work for the team? Do you work for the network? You appear on both. And they are partners, obviously, so there is some gray area there. But I think the big thing that the Brewers offered me was an opportunity to join the team directly, but also kind of create this digital series and provide access and an opportunity and a platform with the Brewers digital team to create this YouTube series, Brewers on Tap. That's something that I like doing, I kind of similar to the Dominican Republic project, which was, on a much bigger scale, to do a couple kind of full length shows and do a series like that. That was an incredible project, one of those like once in a lifetime that you hope isn't once in a lifetime. But I love doing kind of more long form interviews. I love the sit down format. I love, feature writing and putting together kind of those feature shows. And that's honestly just not something I had a lot of time nor opportunity to do with Fox. We could do it, when we could, and they would always encourage more of that kind of content. But it's tough when, for Fox Sports Wisconsin, they're covering both the Milwaukee Bucks and the Milwaukee Brewers. And so between those two teams, it's almost 220, 225 regular season games, and then playoffs and all of it. So the calendar year goes pretty quickly, and resources are limited. So I think with the Brewers, it was, the opportunity to continue and investing more, being the on-field reporter during the season and at spring training, and then also this digital platform to be able to do kind of more of the featurey type stuff, some off-the-field stuff with players, and working with our digital team with the Brewers, who are so extremely talented, to put together more of that kind of content for both the broadcast and also for digital.
You, as a part of a broadcast or a part of a team, and with Brian Anderson's ties to Texas and with his brother Mike, have gotten to know Brian, and he's obviously someone who's achieved at a really high level. And it just seems like both the radio and TV teams with the Brewers are really close and some really good people. But on the TV side of things, what does it mean to you to be a part of a team, and what are some of the things you've learned that have been important in developing that chemistry and I guess being a good team player, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this, that like this time that we've been shut down from baseball, and hopefully we can come back soon, I think you become so much more aware of all of those things that you miss on the daily basis. And I'm sure, Jared, you feel the same way in your role of like, what I miss is the people. What I miss is, we were 2 weeks away from opening day, and you've spent now almost a month with this new team. And for us, we had significant turnover from the team from last year that went to the wild card game. Virtually half of the major league roster from that game was gone. And there was an extremely busy off season for the Brewers. They had brought in a lot of new players. We were starting to get to know them. Plus, the guys coming back from the last couple of seasons, and you were kind of waiting to see how is all this going to fit. How's this team going to kind of gel together? And that's what I miss. I miss the people. I miss talking to Craig Counsell every day. I miss the coaching staff. I miss the players. I miss the time in the clubhouse. I miss watching them take BP every day. Talking to our coaches about what they're working on with certain players, and they were really at that point where you were ready to get this thing going again. And you know that like when you start a season, you're along for the ride, and I've learned kind of that over the years is to just kind of enjoy the ride. Like it's, when things are going pretty good, sometimes you're like, all right, well, things are going to take a dip here. Like things are never as good as they seem. And then when things are going poorly for the team, it's like, well, it's never as bad as what it seems either. So I've learned that more than anything the last couple of years, of just kind of how to enjoy that ride of a season And fortunately for the Brewers, they've had great success the last 2 years to make it into the postseason. I don't take for granted, being on the field or in the room for those celebrations. I mean, it is special, to be in that room and to watch a group of people celebrate, what they've been working for all year long. So yeah, I think this time has really opened my eyes to like all those things that we miss that are also part of doing our job, being in the clubhouse, being at BP, watching guys take early work, talking to them about what's going on the field, off the field. Also new players who come into the mix, whether it's a call up or a trade or whatever, who come up and make a big impact. I mean, I just miss all of that, and telling those stories and how the stories change month to month during a baseball season.
All right, 2 more questions for you, Sophia. The first one, I saw that the Milwaukee Business Journal named you among their top 40 under 40. I don't know if this is something that means a lot to you or not, but I know sometimes when you receive these honors, it forces you or it allows you a second to just kind of reflect on where you are and what you've done. It did. Congrats on that honor, first of all. Second of all, was there any part of that that you experienced on your end, like reflecting where you are and maybe kind of taking some inventory on what you've accomplished and maybe what's next? Or was that just kind of one of those things where it's like, hey, I don't know. I don't really, the awards don't really mean a whole lot to me, and I'm not going to really think about it too much.
No, I mean, it was a very cool recognition. I was very grateful to the people that nominated me. I mean, it's a fairly extensive process, and they draw hundreds of candidates and submissions. So I certainly am grateful, like, for those that wanted to nominate me and doing that work. And, you're always kind of uncomfortable with that, at least I am, I'm like, oh, I don't know, like, there's got to be someone better. I'm just like, when you see kind of the rest of the candidates in the 40 under 40 class, you're like, wow, these people are doing such incredible work in the community and in their respective fields. And I'm like, I just sports, I cover Major League Baseball. You almost feel like you're not worthy being in that same group. But it is really cool recognition. It does make you kind of take stock of, what you've been able to do. And I think for us, being in the media, kind of this platform that we have and being visible and not taking that for granted either. It was very cool. It was a cool event. They did it over spring training this year, so fairly recently. And then it also just introduced me to a whole new group of people right here in Milwaukee that, again, are doing really amazing things in the city and great leaders. And it was cool to be included with them and kind of create a new network of people to kind of go to and talk to about things.
So, the last thing I want to ask you, and you kind of leading into it, mentioning the platform and all I do is cover baseball, but I know that's not actually the case. I always like to talk to people about some of the charity work they're involved in, because I do think it's such a big part of, maybe in our industry, we have some kind of a platform, and you've really, it seems like, connected with the MACC Fund in support of, or I guess maybe defense against childhood cancer and awareness. First of all, what can people do, or what should people know, and how they can maybe support and take part in what you're doing, and what led you down that path, and what has that experience been like, connecting with the people and putting forth some effort down that particular avenue?
Yeah, the MACC Fund is a really cool organization, and it's something I was aware of it as a kid, but it was really when I started working for the Milwaukee Bucks, because it was founded by John McLaughlin, who was one of the original Bucks, and the former Bucks radio announcer Eddie Doucette, whose son had leukemia as a child. And so they, this was in the 70s. So, childhood cancer was extremely rare at that point. There wasn't a lot of awareness. There was almost no research for it. So they created the MACC Fund, Midwest Athletes Against Childhood Cancer. And I mean, now it's just taken off, and they've raised millions and millions and millions of dollars over the years. The Bucks do an annual MACC Fund game. One of their preseason games is always a fundraiser for the MACC Fund. The Bucks are still very heavily involved in that. But John McLaughlin was our TV analyst for more than 30 years with the Bucks. And so when I was covering the Bucks, I got to learn more about the MACC Fund through Johnny Mac and through his family. And it just kind of connected with me. It's like you think about these kids who are so sick at such a young age, and how it impacts their families and all of it. So it's research based. It's research based in order to find a cure for childhood cancer. It's treatment based. So it's been really cool to be a part of that on their Emerging Leaders Board, to work on events, fundraisers, awareness, all of it. So it's something that I've been a part of for the last couple of years, and also just being close to Marquette, doing some mentoring with them over at the College of Com and in their alumni program. So it's been nice that I'm still still connected, like, to Milwaukee and to Marquette, my alma mater, and be able to do different things here and there when I'm able to.